As long as there are situations where tenure and promotion committees only know about the person they're considering by looking at a journal impact factor, they don't really know that much about that particular discipline or about how new forms of scholarship are going to contribute to the field. As long as that is the case, I think it's going to be hard, to dig out of that hole. I think universities making commitments to move away, raising awareness of what publishers do will help researchers be more amenable to the things we need them to do when they're submitting for publication. You may well think you know a space until you have a different perspective. Volunteering for industry initiatives and standards groups will help you to kind of get that perspective to see what areas you might want to look into, where you can learn more.
Welcome to insightsxchange, the intersection of ideas and academia. I'm Nikesh Gosalia. Every episode, I engage with the brightest minds and industry experts who are shaping the landscape of research and publishing. Get ready to be inspired, challenged, and enlightened as we explore the frontiers of knowledge together. This is where thought leaders and ideas converge, so welcome aboard. Today, we are joined by Heather Staines, a veteran in scholarly communications and the Director of Community Engagement at Delta Think. Heather's vast experience spans across prestigious organizations like the MIT Knowledge Futures Group and ProQuest. Heather, a historian by training with a PhD from Yale University, brings over 25 years of rich experience in roles from editorial director to e-product manager. Her work extends globally, impacting both publishers and libraries. She is also a passionate contributor to SSP, NISO, and other industry organizations, where she gives back through her involvement in committees, educational programs, and mentorship. Heather, we are thrilled to have you with us to share your insights and views in which the industry has shaped up and where it's headed. So welcome once again.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here with you today.
Okay, so to start with, obviously we go back quite a few years, Heather. I've known you for more than 10 years now. But just for the benefit of the listeners, can you tell us a little bit about your journey and how you became involved in the field of scholarly communications in the first place, and what inspired your career path?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. As you mentioned, I started as a historian. I was fortunate during some postdoc years at Yale University. It was very difficult then to get an academic job. It's still difficult. But my dissertation advisor had perhaps noticed in me a love for writing and rewriting, maybe more rewriting than actually writing at that time. And he suggested that I make sort of a meet and greet visit to Yale University Press. The then editorial director, Charles Grench, was very open with his time. And I ended up doing a volunteer internship there, where I kind of staked my claim in the scholarly space. I eventually got a job at a company called Greenwood Publishing Group, Prager Publishers, where I worked for 11 years. And that company went to an XML workflow for books in 2004, which I like to say was like dinosaur days for XML workflows. And, as a researcher myself, I could see the definite potential for being able to search books electronically. In order to do electronic publishing full-time, I needed to move into the STM space. So I joined Springer SBM, which was the precursor to Springer Nature, as the product manager for Springer Link. I learned everything that was needed, to make a platform go, from access to metadata dissemination to ANI, SEO, digital preservation, Crossref, and the like. And I like to say the most important thing I learned was that I didn't really want to be a product manager, but that's important to know. I did a stint through the startup space, as you mentioned, and eventually landed in the spring of 2021 with my current employer, Delta Think. So it's definitely a twisty attorney road, having worked in both books and journals, having been sort of customer facing and non-customer facing, and as it turns out, great preparation to work as a consultant.
Thank you so much, Heather. And that's really interesting. And maybe we'll come back to a few points that you mentioned. One of the things that you did talk about is that you've seen a lot of change since the time you were, a researcher or you were studying yourself, and to things in the present day. And one of the big changes, the push towards open access. Open access is a big part of what you've worked on in your career. We know that the trends are clearly changing, but can you talk a little bit about how you first learned about it and how you work with it today?
Yeah, it's been a really kind of enlightening journey for me. I'd say the first I heard of it was shortly after joining Springer, where I needed to know about certain open articles that were on the SpringerLink platform. And not too long after I joined Springer, Springer actually acquired Biomed Central. So that really expanded the open access portfolio that Springer had in play. We started talking a lot more to our library advisory boards about open access. So then I was looking at OA both from a journal and an individual article perspective, which we all know is very challenging in terms of metadata and conveying that to researchers. Springer really expanded their work in OA during the 4.5 years that I was there. We did a lot of conference presentations and library advisory board meetings talking about different OA offerings. It seemed to me very clear that the direction of research was headed towards open. After Springer, I joined a startup in the course material space called SIPX, the Stanford Intellectual Property Exchange. And in that role, I worked with a whole variety of different publishers, including publishers in the open educational resources area, which was new to me, learning about textbooks that were 100% free, for students to use, expanded my horizons in that front. We also had a collaboration at that time with the Copyright Clearance Center to determine whether research or whether professors who were assigning readings for classes could make more affordable options available to students. So if they found out, for example, using a book chapter might cost $12 per student and a reader, they could substitute a less expensive or even a free version. So my interest in open access really grew during that time. SIPX was eventually acquired by ProQuest, and I worked in the Global Content Alliance team with a number of open access content provider initiatives within my purview. I talked to a lot of libraries that had archives in areas LGBTQ, ethnic, significant libraries. And while we wanted to make content from those libraries available through platforms like ProQuest, the libraries that were holding that content didn't necessarily have the capability to generate metadata at all, let alone, generate metadata that would inform a knowledge base, that content, was open. So I'll say a number of the nuances around open, being able to show an open access license and metadata, to be able to show that articles within a journal, even though that journal might be paywalled, that those individual articles were open, or delayed open access articles. I think my interest in the complexities around metadata probably started to happen at that time. Fast forward, a little bit to today, when Delta Think reached out to me about the role that I have now. They mentioned this open access data and analytics tool that is a subscription offering to libraries and publishers and aggregators to look at market trends, both in the output of content, the costs associated with that content, revenue associated with that content. I thought it would be a perfect opportunity to be able to keep my hand in with open access while still doing more more general work in the consulting space. And then of course, we all went through the pandemic. We're kind of still in it, but in a kind of different phase now. And I will say that before the pandemic, my fellow researchers in history and even some in social sciences were not aware of open access publishing to the extent that they are now. But publishers and platforms opening up content during the pandemic really opened the eyes for historians and social science researchers. They went from thinking that a publisher who contacted them with a request that something be published open was somehow automatically suspect to thinking, hey, the research populations I work with can have access to the research output at no cost. Instructors can use content in courses at no cost to students. And so I think a lot of the inequities that were revealed during COVID and the increase in uptake of OA during COVID has really kind of expanded the horizons into the space where researchers like me are operating today.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, Heather. And you spoke about metadata, so just had a question on that. How do you see industry standards and metadata playing a pivotal role in the scholarly ecosystem? And if there are any examples of how adherence to these standards has benefited the community?
Oh, in so many ways. When you ask me about metadata, you're probably going to have to stop me because I will continue to talk about metadata. I think one of the first industry presentations I ever did was at an American Library Association meeting, and it was about DOIs. I reached out to Peter McCracken, who founded Serial Solutions, because he had done a presentation that I saw on DOIs, and I asked him if I could use some images from his slide, and he was very, generous with that. And I was very excited going to ALA to talk about metadata. But when I would mention it to colleagues, I would often get this like confused or glazed expression. And I'd say, no, 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 no. Metadata is incredibly exciting. And I think, the work that I've done over the past more than 10 years now is to try to get people as excited about metadata, as I am. I've been involved in a number of different metadata initiatives. I was a member of the Crossmark working group in the early days when Crossref was trying to find a great way to inform researchers there had been an update or a correction to content, through updates in metadata. I was an early participant in what is now the NISO transfer committee, but was initially a UKSG initiative. So many folks are probably aware that scholarly journals can move from platform to platform, and there's a risk when that happens that libraries might lose access to their subscriptions, and even with open content that you might lose access because link resolvers or DOI may not resolve properly. So I've been in the transfer committee now for more than a decade, and we try to keep up with changes in how content is accessed, how it might be accessed in multiple places, which requires metadata updates. The counter standard around usage and what metadata is necessary in order to track usage properly so that libraries can demonstrate the impact of the resources that they invest in content, and even now in open access content, involves metadata. So again, it's a crucial underpinning. The recent OSTP memo referred to the use of identifiers so that machines would be able to adequately access content by picking up on that metadata. So as we kind of go into the future and try to anticipate what future researchers will need and future content providers will need, I think metadata is taking even more of a central role. I will say I have seen there's a lot of challenges around metadata. It's always getting to be more complex, but publishers and libraries, I think, have seen a kind of a hollowing out of technical expertise and a kind of an outsourcing, if you might say, to either content platforms or third-party vendors. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. In many cases, the resulting metadata is fantastic, and it takes a lot of the burden off of smaller publishers so that they can focus on the publication. But it does mean that there's a dependency created, and it's really important in terms of education that all of the stakeholders in the space continue to understand the importance. They might not be hands-on, in generating that metadata, but they should understand that it's crucial and that if it went away, it would be a very bad thing for researchers and libraries.
Absolutely. We've heard quite a bit that open source and open infrastructure are very important in academic publishing. Can you discuss the role they play in reshaping the industry and driving innovation?
Yeah, the first open source company I worked for was Hypothesis, which is an open source annotation technology, and I did publisher outreach. There was also quite a lot of activity and continues to be so on the education side. So a lot of the learning that I had around open source, came from there. I think we all use open source tools and technology every day, although we might not be aware of it. One example that I used to give when I was at Hypothesis is the WordPress platform. Many of our organizations will have our websites. We may have our personal blogs on WordPress. WordPress is an open source technology. The parent company, Automatic, with two T's, if you want to look it up, has released WordPress as a commercial product to support the open source venture. So you will see many open source companies that kind of proceed on this parallel track. The advantages of open source is that programmers can build upon it, but the downside of that is you do need to have some technical capacity in order to take advantage of it. So this has created a space where there are third-party providers. For example, a lot of scholar-led publications might live on an OJS platform, and the PKP, the Public Knowledge Project out of Simon Fraser University up in Vancouver, will manage OJS instances for scholar-led journals that, again, don't have that technical capacity. So whether or not you can use open source and the degree to which you can use it, there's a lot of questions you need to ask your organization. We're seeing more and more tools and technologies come out of institutions, and in many cases, they're able to build upon what's been done, in the open source space, the open infrastructure space. After leaving Hypothesis, I went to the MIT Knowledge Futures Group, as you mentioned, to be able to work on the open source hosting platform PubPub, which hosts journals and books and databases and all sorts of great, community projects. And, one of the kind of forms of thinking behind the Knowledge Futures Group was that these initiatives that bubble up within academia should have a place to go. That not every open source tool, needs to necessarily become a company or needs to chase philanthropic funding. Some of them, can find a home in a kind of like open source, incubator initiative, like the Knowledge Futures Group has. And I think universities are starting to think more and more, universities and publishers are thinking more and more about how the community can benefit from open infrastructure. While I was at the Knowledge Futures Group, MIT did a big project, so it's probably 2019 now, called Mind the Gap, where they went and looked at, I think, more than 50 open infrastructure and open tool projects and looked at best practices around funding, best practices around governance, and how that, led into sustainability. The whole community benefits if there's open infrastructure, but if open infrastructure is not sustainable, if it doesn't have a business model, then things that are built upon that, could potentially be damaged or even go away. So I think open infrastructure plays a vital role, but it has to be one that, is well thought of and has sustainable and even succession planning. Because if you need to transfer content or metadata or anything else, digital resources out to move them, to another platform, that has to be something that's anticipated from the start. So a topic that's very, very dear to my heart, lots of complexities there. If you want to learn more about open infrastructure, there's invest in open infrastructure, has a lot of resources. The Force 11 working group is a great conference and listserv venue to highlight all of these scholar-led, initiatives that really are, gaining traction, less speed than we see in the commercial space, but for the groups who are involved, it's near and dear to their hearts.
Thank you for sharing that, Heather. And I think we'll make it a point to highlight some of the sources that you mentioned, because I guess a lot of the listeners will benefit from that. Another topic which is very close to your heart is inclusivity and diversity. And I know that there are a lot of steps being taken in this direction. But just in your opinion, how can the field of scholarly communication become more inclusive and diverse in terms of both participation and content representation?
I think I've always been interested in how we can expand awareness about scholarly communications as a profession. I always say you fall in love with scholarly communications because of the people. And if you don't ever get to meet people involved in scholarly communications, then that won't happen for you. So I do worry. We can talk a little bit about the post-COVID generation working in the space and some of the challenges they entail. But there have been a lot of reports and a lot of data generated about the gender representation, geographic and ethnic diversity in the profession. So I think it is very important for all of the organizations, publishers, suppliers, startups who are working in the space to keep this front of mind. I think I started to think more about this in an organized way when SSP started, I think initially through a task force, and I think connected to the early career subcommittee, which was looking at who was coming into the profession. Over time, that has become really a key part of what SSP considers to be its mission and core values. And it's been exciting. I was on the board for the first time probably in this sort of 2011, 2012 time period, and coming back recently on the board as president-elect. It's been, so heartening to see in that context how the EDI and DEIA committees, depending on which side of which part of the world you're located in, have really grown and become central to every aspect of the work of SSP. So trying to make sure that all of the programming that organizations do will have a broad appeal, that the folks who are participating in organizing that programming are diverse, that the speakers who are presenting in that context represent a variety of different perspectives, and that we really make sure that there's follow on about the relevancy, of that content. One thing I've seen happening, I think, in the UK that I haven't seen as much in the United States is to take out college degree requirements for a lot of starter jobs, a lot of entry-level jobs, when it may not be 100% necessary for a person to have had a college degree, which gives more opportunity to folks who come from different income levels to start out in publishing. I think that's been a great development. I'd like to see that expanded further. Publishing can be heavily concentrated in certain regions. So here in the Northeast of the United States, New York, for example, one of the things that's been happening in New York has been that internships really need to be paid internships. So I won't say that the non-paid internships have gone away, but I think, 10, 15 years ago, it was expected that you kind of had to put your time in unpaid internships. This is across industries, not just in publishing. And there was a recognition that as long as that was the case, that only folks that came from a privileged background could afford to do an unpaid internship. So that change, I think, has been, in a very positive direction. I've been, for the last 2 years, co-chair of the ALPSP EDI working group. So I've had an opportunity with folks on that working group to look at what initiatives are happening within publishing houses, to at first kind of benchmark what is the current state of diversity amongst staff, amongst authors, peer reviewers, editorial boards, whatever group that you're looking at. And there's all kinds of efforts underway to kind of get a benchmark for that current state, so we can demonstrate progress in the coming years to making that possible. We've done a number of projects at Delta Think to help publishers move forward with those initiatives. Self-reporting on the basis of authors and editorial boards is going to give the best data, obviously with fully privacy preserving efforts in place, and GDPR compliant handling of data. But there are some best practices around ANI tools that can match with a fairly high degree of accuracy names to gender, to area of origin, and the like. And we've worked with some tools that have global data sets, because there are some problems around some of the tools being more leaning more towards Western names. So I think that there's a growing recognition amongst companies that we need to do better in that regard, and mentorship is key. So my first year that I did mentorship through the International Association of STM Publishers, I ended up with 3 mentees, and one was in the United States, one was in Australia, and one was in Delhi in India. It's such a rewarding experience to work with mentors, regardless of where they're based, regardless of which department in publishing, that they're in, or perhaps if they're not even in publishing, perhaps if they're in libraries. But it does raise the challenge of time zones. As we know, we're sitting here recording this today, spanning many time zones. If you sign up to be a mentor, or if you're an organization that's setting up, mentorship, be mindful that you want to serve mentees regardless of their region, and ask both the mentors and the mentees about their availability. I used to host a call when I was global e-product manager for Springer Link. I hosted a call with our Asia and South Asia locations, and the call happened at 4:30 a.m. my time. It was such a wonderful experience. It was pre-video, so I didn't have to make myself look camera ready in those days. It was just audio. And I used to kind of do some vocal exercises before everyone started to come onto the line at 4:30 a.m. because particularly the colleagues based in Tokyo would express sort of sadness if my voice sounded like they were the first person that I spoke to in the morning. So I would like to make sure it sounded like I have been speaking for a while. But as Tokyo and Hong Kong and Beijing and Delhi and occasionally Australia and New Zealand or Korea would come online, it was just great to be able to communicate with them. But I felt that the colleagues in those offices always got the short end of the stick when it came to the times that they had to join the call. So I really feel strongly, in work-life balance, but also when you're working with early careers, that you don't always expect them to take the bad time zone, that you're willing to take some of that on yourself. So I think if we pull together kind of on all of these different fronts, on making publishing, broadening the awareness of publishing as a profession, making it more welcoming to people who come in through these different initiatives, and showing diversity in all aspects of our workflow, that we will be an attractive force in the future, and will be strengthened by more people coming into the profession.
When you shared your experience, Heather, of waking up at 4:30 in the morning, preparing yourself, and that just shows how passionate you are to really make this work. And while you were talking about that, one of the things that came to my mind was that DEI also means global representation, especially from geographies and cultures that generally are underrepresented. I'm just wondering, based on your observations and your experience, is there something which is very obvious that comes to your mind to ensure that global representation in scholarly publishing is happening across the board?
Wow, there's not one thing that immediately springs to mind, but there are a few I have been on my mind lately. I mean, during COVID, when most meetings moved to the virtual space, we definitely saw a broader array of participation, in those meetings, both from an attendee standpoint, but also from a presenter standpoint. I think most of us would agree that we don't get as much value from the virtual as we do for face to face. So I don't think the one, is a substitute, for the other. So enabling more regional meetings to take place. I mean, SSP has done regional meetings in the US and Europe. I'm not as aware as I should be about initiatives that have been happening in other areas of the world, but that could well be something to look at. Building up, mentorships, for folks there. One thing which I participated in recently, which is maybe not a direct answer to your question, but maybe could be replicated to become an answer. I'm part of the planning for the SSP New Direction Seminar, which happens in September every year in person in the Washington, D.C. area. Even before COVID, there was a kind of live streaming element of the New Direction Seminar. So it wasn't what we would think of as completely hybrid meeting, but attendees from anywhere could watch and submit their questions, and someone in the room would add their questions. And so I have developed a reputation for someone who does more interactive or unusual sessions. And so I put out this idea that we could do something called reverse roundtables. And the idea behind the reverse roundtables was attendees, both in the room and online, while in the room would stay at the tables where they were sitting, and the facilitators on these different sort of 5 phases of the research life cycle would move around, and there would be 3 conversations within the time allotted for the session. And the same thing would happen online. Attendees would be in a Zoom room, and facilitators would go around and have these conversations. And I felt from the outset that I didn't want to just ask the usual suspects. So it'd be very easy to go and, go to my friends, the people I've known the longest, and say, hey, would you like to, facilitate a session? I wanted to get some newer folks there, folks who, early career broadly defined, like meaning less experience than you or I have. So earlier career, and the opportunity for new directions, given that there was an in-person opportunity as well as an online opportunity, was really a great chance to kind of put this into effect. So I reached out to folks that I knew, and I said, hey, are there folks in your organization who have fewer opportunities to present? And that might be because they're earlier in their career, or that might be because they're in production or indexing or something which, maybe isn't as easily depicted on a panel. And I got wonderful suggestions across the board. And I will say, if I had realized it was going to take 18 of us to do this session, I might have changed the plan. But from the 18, I would say 12 people were new to me. And so we ended up with a geographic spread, a departmental spread of participants. And I think almost universally the feedback from the attendees was that they loved to hear from folks from different departments with different backgrounds. And now that we've done that, once in the context of SSP, we kind of know the formula for doing it again. So perhaps we could do something where more senior folks like you or I would reach out and maybe nominate some folks, with, in the sort of 7 to 10 year experience level space to facilitate some workshops, and that maybe it's tied to an in-person component with a virtual component, or we could even do it, exclusively, in the virtual space. So while it did involve a lot of logistics and I had a lot of help on it, the outcome, was wonderful. And I think, we definitely want to do that again.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, Heather. And now I know if I need some creative out of box ideas, who to reach out to. But I love that. We've been talking in some of the conferences, in some of the panel discussions about a lot of challenges at the same time, a lot of opportunities within the industry as well. In your opinion, what are the most pressing challenges or opportunities facing the scholarly communications world today, and how can we address them effectively?
Yeah, I mentioned before, I think we have a challenge around folks who are new to the profession because we're an industry that is so largely relationship based. People move around, they change their roles within companies, they move around companies, but it's worth investing your time in people because there's a reasonable expectation you will see them again, in some way, shape, or form. And so when a lot of our roles went, I was remote prior to the pandemic, but when a lot of more traditional spaces went virtual, and this is continuing to happen more and more, with folks selling their office space or downsizing their office space, I think the folks who are new to the profession take the biggest hit as far as that goes. If you haven't been able to meet your team, and there are, I can guarantee, people out there 3 years in who have maybe met no one on their team, or they've met maybe one person, and that one person they've met a few times, or they've met their team at a once a year, kind of get together, which is better than nothing. But your investment in the profession is going to be less, and it's not based on your enthusiasm. But if a friend of yours comes and says, "Hey, I want to start a cupcake business down the road," and you may say, "Okay, I don't have a lot, to lose from saying farewell, to folks who are on a screen." So I think with that in mind, we need to find new ways to get people together. Budget that may have been spent previously on internal travel, a head of a department has to hit every single office where they have workers, like that has seems to have gone and not come back. And but using that for retreats for teams, using that to get folks to conferences where they may have other folks from the organization, that will be well spent because you will have a pipeline of dedicated employees that you can promote up into the organization. And if all organizations are doing it, you will have folks who are well trained when roles open, at your organization. We're kind of in this together. So let's not look at it's a false savings if you're losing the people that you need, to move forward. We will go extinct like the dinosaurs if we don't have early careers who think of us as a great opportunity. The biggest challenge, I think, there's so many, but again, misinformation and disinformation. This is not limited to scholarly communications, but it's something that we've started to talk about more and more. Research integrity, how to make sure that the scholarly communications record is accurate, is trusted, and approaching that from a number of different angles, from the publisher editorial board, and staff perspective to the peer reviewer perspective, making sure that peer reviewers are looking, at not just content, but, data and code and the like. The different ethics requirements, which I think are changing, all the time, about what is acceptable research if there are human participants, if research is being done in a part of the world that maybe the researcher's home country would not, they're doing it there because they couldn't get permission to do it. So I think that the bar is rising higher and higher around all of these things. The way I think to tackle that has got to be through collaboration. One publisher can know if there's duplicate submissions, or if there's a suspected, paper mill, or the like, but you can't know what's been identified by another publisher. So I think I like to see things like the Research Integrity Hub that the International STM Association has put together. I like to see the new startups that are trying to tackle that, because it is not something where we can have 15 different solutions. That will take way too much time. We've tried that before in different to tackle different problems, and it hasn't worked. So I think publishers and vendors in the space working together, closely to try to find solutions that are scalable and that again free up publishers and editors and researchers, to do the things that they really need to do. That's the best path to move forward.
Thank you, Heather. As someone with experience in both commercial and nonprofit sectors, can you briefly discuss the differences in approach and priorities in scholarly communication between these two sectors?
One of the things that I probably work on, every day now in the context of my work at Delta Think is looking at mission-driven organizations, looking at society, publishers, and how their programs are being affected by changing funder mandates or changing trends in business models. Some folks might say society publishers, particularly larger society or association publishers, are indistinguishable at the end of the day from commercial publishers. They have large publication operations. They may have large conference organizations that they run, and their publication and research output at the end of the day looks very similar to that from the commercial side. But so many of the societies are using the revenue generated from their publications and their conferences to support training initiatives, to support career development paths in the profession. And when they need to change business models, or when conferences change either to become virtual or hybrid or to go back to in person, the money that they can put back into those activities can be affected. So I think that's a big difference. I will also say that overall society publishers have been slower to move into the open access space. Many of them have very complex governing structures, or volunteer structures that are kind of behind their own timeline. But many of them were just getting into like launching open journals around the time when Plan S came out and sort of raised the bar around different more requirements around open. So I'll say that for many reasons, it's a little bit more of a challenge for them. As a result, we've seen more scholarly publishers move to commercial publishers, and that can be a great opportunity for them. Again, it can help them to benefit from economies of scale. It can help them, tap into larger investment resources that those commercial publishers might have, but they might also feel they're being disambiguated from their author base, from their member base. So it's definitely there are pros and cons. So when I think about nonprofit, society kind of bubbles up to be top of mind. I touched a little bit on how open infrastructure and open source companies are different. I think that we need both. We need a diversity. Before you asked a little bit about bibliodiversity, or diversity in output, and I didn't quite get to that. So let me kind of loop back around. One of the areas where I think bibliodiversity and diversity of output is the clearest right now is the university press space, particularly in terms of books, not exclusively, but particularly in terms of books. There have been a number of open access, business models. There was the Schaefer project for historical monographs, the Tome project as well, the open source publishing platforms like University of Michigan's Fulcrum, University of Minnesota's Manifold, the Open Library of Humanities, out of the UK, which has led to like the COPIM collaboration there. And so we see lots of experiments being tried, in that nonprofit space, and there are many companies that are making it work. There were kind of community-led funding initiatives in the book space before Subscribe to Open kind of came to be in the journal space. So there's different models and pathways. There's so much that can be learned from it, but the danger in that space is that the infrastructure can lack support. Having worked in the nonprofit space and having to do grant proposals, I know very well that the bright and shiny tools get a lot of the attention. So right now, you can guess that's probably the AI tools around misinformation, primarily. And the funders maybe are less interested. Mellon used to be a big funder of open infrastructure, and they've kind of, shifted their program a bit. But we need to make sure that these open infrastructure projects and these nonprofit initiatives can continue to exist, because commercial entities, when they see a great thing happening in the non-profit space, will take up the charge there. So I think it is a community benefit to support that type of company based diversity as well.
In the scholarly communications world, in the publishing world rather, where the researchers are driven by this fear for publish or perish, do you think we are doing enough, Heather, to mentor younger researchers, or can say societies play a larger role in that?
It's a good question. It's very probably discipline specific, and a lot of the things that societies are doing now. We have a lot of talk in scholarly communications about impact factor and how we need to move away from impact factor, for a variety of different reasons. And so, a lot of times, the participants who aren't at the table at scholarly communications events are the university sides of things. And as long as there are situations where tenure and promotion committees only know about the person they're considering by looking at a journal impact factor, they don't really know that much about that particular discipline or about how new forms of scholarship are going to contribute to the field. As long as that is the case, I think it's going to be hard, to dig out of that hole. I think universities making commitments to move away from that, like the DORA Declaration of Open Research Assessment, that goes a long way, but there's a lot of waivers and loopholes and exceptions that happen. So I think that there's more work to be done. If you are a university or a department that supports open publications, at the end of the day, I think you need to put that in your job announcements. Say, we support open research. We want to hire someone who is dedicated to that. The first time someone learns about open access publishing should not be when they're looking at a tenure portfolio. They should know about it, all along, and starting there and making sure that there's a broad awareness and at the graduate student level, even the undergraduate level, probably, will go a long way. And when I talk about this being very discipline specific, I come from the humanities, and one of the things that's really exciting to me is the work that's being done in digital humanities. And it's really hard for tenure and promotion committees to get their brains around these digital humanities projects. Usually they exist on standalone websites because hosting platforms, may or may not be flexible enough to host them. It's very challenging to peer review websites. In some instances, once something gets picked up for publication, the whole thing might need to pick up and move from the university website to the university press or publisher's website. So there are, standards and metadata challenges, involved with that. They're literally impossible to preserve. As somebody with their heart in digital preservation, to preserve a very interactive and complex and robust digital humanities project, you need to basically flatten it and take snapshots and kind of like destroy it, not permanently, but for the preservation record, it kind of needs to be destroyed. And so, to what degree the future will be aware of these wonderful projects, that is something, that definitely worries me. I think raising awareness of what publishers do will help researchers be more amenable to the things we need them to do when they're submitting for publication. when we ask them. The time to get them to give information is going to be when they're submitting for publication. And they are the ones who know so well what are going to be the best keywords that can generate metadata for indexing and discovery. They're going to know what are going to be the best classes some research might be usable in, so that a publisher can map it to credentialing and course programs, but those researchers are pressed for time, and what they really want to do is research. They don't necessarily want to publish. So I think raising awareness of why we ask them to do the things we ask them, and when we ask them to do that, whether that's depositing their data, whether that's filling out conflicts of interest or ethical statements, will help them understand that publishers are not the bad guys in the space, and that that type of education, I think, will help them look at publishers as partners and not just this kind of irritating thing that they need to do at the end of the day for their research in order to get their tenure and promotion.
Agree with you, Heather. We've been talking a lot within the industry about the role of technology, and we've also been seeing, some sort of progress. I was at the Frankfurt Book Fair, and a lot of people now starting to bring that into conversations, asking about, the kind of progress that organizations like ours are also making. From your perspective, in your opinion, can you talk a little bit about your views in terms of the evolving role of technology in academic publishing? And if that evolution has started, how is it transforming the way researchers and readers interact with scholarly content?
Yeah, I mean, when I think of tools, I first think about the tools that we use in our work. So we're using a wonderful tool today, Riverside, which I've used before, here. All of the video conferencing tools that we were using pre-pandemic that we're using even more so now, the AI companions that will take notes for you in meetings, the otter.ai that will do transcripts. All of that has really changed the way that we work. I mean, I was one of the first employees back at Greenwood Publishing Group, Prager Publishers, to work offsite. There was one guy who did it before me, and he was kind of up in like Vermont somewhere, and sometimes we would forget to include him. He came in once a year, I think, for the holiday party. But when I moved away, I wanted to keep my job as an editor, and I wanted to be as much of a participant in the department as I could. And we didn't even have conference call lines. I could call in for a department meeting, but two people couldn't call in. If there were more than one of us, we had to call in succession. And oftentimes you couldn't hear at all. We didn't have those, I used to call them the Klingon phones, those sort of triangular foot phones that sat in the middle of the conference table, which helped to be able to listen. And I mean, from an, accessibility standpoint, just not optimal. You couldn't hear and you couldn't see. So if we can't make it work with the tools we have today, we're not really putting in the effort. But the tools that we use, to publish have certainly, changed, dramatically. I think about all of the different tools that come together in the process, from submitting a manuscript to the peer reviewer interacting with it, to the parallel development that happens for the online version and the print version, if there is indeed still a print version, all of the automated processes that go through to create the tags and the schemas that make things discoverable, that enable things to be loaded. I remember, again, back at Greenwood, we were pretty early in the days of ebooks, but there was a poor woman in, I think she was in a department called editorial administration, that had to send out 31 different formats of each ebook. That the standardization has definitely helped us in this space. So that was a situation that, no one should have to send out 31 different versions. Of course, with the automation tools and stuff we have in place, we could maybe send out unlimited versions, but it wouldn't be one person, responsible for doing that. So I think that the tools have definitely improved. That said, I think a lot of the tools that we still use today were created with a print first workflow in mind. And if we were to start them again, we wouldn't do them in quite the same way. So I like to see, new initiatives that are coming out, which are trying to rethink how we do things. There's like so many technologies that a publisher or a vendor can integrate. And how do you decide? You may not have the technical staff or the time or the resources to select. So one of the things we do at Delta Think is we might do some research on, what are the five leading products in an area, and what are the pros and cons, what might fit best with a client need. Not all of the things that come out are going to be relevant just because they're getting a lot of attention. I think about blockchain and Bitcoin, and we used to play, bingo sometimes, and those were things which you wait for somebody to mention, and then you cover your space or take a drink, or depending on how you celebrated that. And not every technology company is going to survive. So there may be 5 or 25 companies that are looking at AI image manipulation, detecting image manipulation through use of AI. There might be, several companies that are trying to decide what level of copy editing, content can have, so that it can be sent, through the most efficient channel for it. So I think, as we move forward, it's harder in the same way that it's harder for researchers because they have information overload and they want tools that will help them narrow down their content so that they can take a look. We within the industry have almost technology overload, and we need some resources to help us, narrow down what we should be, paying attention to. So it is a kind of like ebb and flow. Once we get a handle on something, then there's another area that's going to expand and take up our bandwidth. So it's going to keep us busy for a long time.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Heather. I think there's a lot of experimentation happening in the industry, which is good in many ways, but at the same time, not all of them will succeed. But it's yeah, it's good to see some of the progress that's happening. One specific question around technology that just came to my mind was: is there any particular area, part of the research workflow, which you think might be positively impacted with the progress in technology?
I think the person you probably should address this question to a researcher, and someone who's an active researcher. I still research. I dabble in research. I mean, researchers can spend their time more wisely than I spent my time when I was a researcher because they can find content more quickly. I mean, no research was online when I was doing my dissertation, and we were lucky if an archive had records online that we could even order things in advance. I remember being so excited when I went to the National Archives in Australia that I could actually ask them, which boxes to have ready for me so that I didn't have to lose a whole day waiting while someone went to get boxes. I also think of, reference managers. We had to create our bibliographies and our notes, by hand, just organizing, all of our research. I remember I had my own sort of organizational strategy, and I would print things out and I would cut them up into little strips, and I had them paper clipped and color coded all around my dorm room. So I mean, researchers, I think, can definitely spend their time more wisely, than they used to. One thing which springs to mind, and again, what I'm thinking of is depend on what I've been working on in the past couple of weeks, largely, but is using AI to make summaries. There's so much content a researcher might want to look at, and just trying to identify that by keywords, or just trying to identify that by publisher recommendations, and not that those things don't provide benefit, they definitely do. But once you have a corpus of material, how do you figure out how to prioritize looking at that, and whether there's something that maybe you can leave aside until later? And I think that there are some newer companies that are promoting summarization tools, and I think that AI, it may not be able to summarize as accurately as a human research assistant would, or as a specialist in the field, but in order to rule out some areas of content, I think the summaries can go a long way. So I think that is definitely an area that I'm looking at. I think the next area will be around data management. And I'm really excited about tools like DataSeer. And full disclosure, I'm on the board of DataSeer, so I think about that a lot. But not just DataSeer. When you're submitting an article, and now with funder mandates that require data sets to be deposited and preserved, that being able to get the researchers thinking, have I put all of the relevant data sets into a repository? It may not even occur to them that some of them are data in the context of the requirements, or in the context of reproducibility or replicability. I know I talk to historians and they're kind of like, I don't think I have data, but they may have transcripts, they may have their own notes, they may have pictures, that they've taken, and it's definitely not quantitative data in the way we think of it, but it's definitely qualitative data. And qualitative data is going to come with its own challenges. When I was at Hypothesis, we worked with the qualitative data repository QDR at Syracuse, and they helped manage data sets that needed different levels of privacy because they might have identifiable information or sensitive information. Let's say, indigenous people were interviewed or something like that. And so it's not just where to put the data, but how to manage it, how to treat it if there are delicate issues involved around it. And so I'm really looking for technology that's going to help both the researcher make that determination, but also help the publishers to ensure that that does get deposited and preserved for posterity.
Absolutely. Since you've had a very diverse career that spans various aspects of scholarly communications, Heather, is there any specific experience that stands out in your mind, or any specific projects that have helped you to better understand the complexities of the ecosystem?
You may well think you know a space until you have a different perspective. Like I would have said during the time, I guess, that I was in the course material startup at SIPEX, that I knew all of the platform hosts, that there were about 5 or 6, and that I knew them, and I had a good handle on what was happening in the space. And then moving over into the open source space, I learned that there was another group of platform hosts. Like I mentioned, the OJS, there's the ARFA platform, the different ones from the university presses that I mentioned, the fact that library publishers publish out of institutional repositories, that it was like, wow, like somebody lifted the curtain and I saw this whole, other side of it. So there's always more, to learn, and it's always more complicated than you think it's going to be. So volunteering for industry initiatives and, standards groups will help you to kind of get that perspective, to see what areas you might want to look into, where you can learn more. I mean, one project I participated in was a project called Hermios, which was a high impact research something in the humanities. It was about monographs. It's under the operas umbrella. And Ubiquity open source platform was leading the annotation work package. So Hypothesis, as the annotation provider, was involved with that. And I was able to attend, some workshops. And so part of the thinking behind this Hermios project was to try to get these open book publishers to utilize more standards, to assign more identifiers, to pay more attention to peer review, and all of the things that, maybe were more commonly done, in the commercial kind of STM space. So that was a really valuable moment for me. I'll say something that resonated strongly with me. I mentioned the PKP team up at Simon Fraser. Juan Pablo Albaran, he was in a workshop one time at SSP, and somebody asked, they said, that there were a number of journals published from different places around the world on PKP OJS, and were some of them predatory? And I will never forget, the way that, Juan answered that question. And he said, there's a difference between journals that are predatory and journals that are learning. And that's always kind of like stayed in the back of my head. And, the things that I learned, with Hermios, what do publishers need to do to kind of make sure they're moving up with that bar to ensure trust, ensure discoverability, ensure sustainability, is that we never forget that there are researcher-led projects, publishers that are trying to get started, and you have to start somewhere. And so making sure that you're not just lumping together folks in that learning category with the folks who are, kind of bad actors. And, I continue to think about that, and I'll use that as a kind of litmus test, moving forward when I learn about new things to focus on in the future.
Brilliant. If you were to think about the next 5 years in scholarly publishing, what kind of trends, come to mind? We've been hearing about a lot of things in terms of, the full move to open access. We've been talking about the rise of preprints, AI technology taking over a lot of stuff that we already do. But yeah, just from your perspective, I mean, what do you think are going to be one or two trends that come to your mind, Heather, if we were to look at the next 5 years?
I think about the next 5 years a lot. I'm part of the STM Future Lab, and every year we get together, and ultimately the conversations we have lead to those infographics, that come out. And, not just tech, used to be called the tech trends, and now it's just called the trends. And so we do look, kind of more broadly than that. So this is something that I think about regularly. We've seen, I think that, the obvious ones are AI and OA, but we've seen more of a focus on services, and whether that's services at a society or a publishing level, if there's a partnership, or whether that's services at a publisher or society providing that to authors. I think we're going to see that, continue to grow. From the researcher standpoint, I think I've said at least a couple times here, the researchers want to do the research. So what is really going to be valuable to them? I think one of the trends is going to be hearing from researchers more about what will save them time, what will make their lives easier, what will make it easier for them to work with a publisher. The format agnostic submission is something more publishers, I think, are open to these days, where a researcher doesn't have to reformat their work to a specific journal at the time before a decision has made. And I interview researchers, from Delta Think all the time, and they say, we're happy to follow a format once we know that it's been accepted. I also think that there will be tools and mechanisms in place to make that reformatting so much more straightforward than it is today, that will take things out of the submission workflow where there's fewer places you need to cut and paste. So like, this isn't rocket science. These are straightforward, efficiencies, I think, that will really be beneficial. I think we will start to see differences in the way that we think about AI. I ran a session at Charleston one time on AI, and I think it was Peter Brantley from the library side from UC Davis that said once, what our definition of what we think of as AI is constantly changing. And once we're used to something, we don't think of it as AI anymore. And of course, we have all kinds of definitions of AI now. But for example, when we first got GPS in our cars, we were like, wow, this is the best thing ever. Now we can't remember how to get anywhere without them, but those are just accepted facts of life. So we don't think of that as special. So I think the bar, will continue to move, and a lot of the things that are more dramatic to try to comprehend now, will just be seen as part of daily life. So I think AI research assistants, I think, we're going to graduate from the really rudimentary chat bots that we interact with online today to AI that can really help us, answer questions, which will save us a lot of time and energy. I love to do, unique session formats for conferences, whether it's musicals or plays. And right now, I happen to be working on one for electronic resources and libraries. That's a futuristic talk show called Researcher Access Hollywood, a talk show for humans and machines. And the guests are always a pair of sort of actors. So one is a human librarian and one is a hologram that works in the library. And they are true colleagues. They see each other as colleagues. And it's a future where I won't say that, AI has citizenship rights or anything like that, but the perspective around AI in this future talk show environment has definitely changed and evolved over time. So I like to think that all of the work that different companies are doing and all of the integrations that publishers and services companies are doing, is going to come out with something on the other end, which we can't anticipate yet. But when it does happen, we'll get used to it and we'll go, oh yeah, why did we not always have that? And then we'll move on to whatever we think is the next shiny thing.
Brilliant. And the final question from my side, Heather, and I know you've partly already answered this, but say if there was somebody who is starting out today in scholarly communications, academic publishing, what advice would you give them?
So, as one of the cohort from my graduate program that did not go into teaching, I have developed a reputation, as someone who can give advice about alternative careers to academia. I think in the science publishing space, we see a lot of ex-scientists who have, moved naturally into a discipline that, they're familiar with. On the flip side on the humanities side and university presses and the like, you see, folks like me, who moved up. And so I think if you are in academia and it's not working, for you for some reason, either you're not relocatable to another space, or, for family issues, or you want to keep your hand in, academically, but you don't want to be on the kind of tenure treadmill. Academic publishing can be a great opportunity. The people are wonderful, top-notch, thoughtful, creative, energizing. There's always more, to discover. I think one challenge in moving into publishing is you see because it's almost like an accidental profession or an apprenticeship type profession, you see the one little space where you start. So if your first job is in marketing, you might be in marketing your whole career, but maybe there are other areas of publishing that would be more suitable for you. I had an intern who became my editorial assistant back when I was working on books, and he got in touch with me one day and he said, I hate to tell you, but I've accepted a job in sales, and it was a job in sales for, our same company. And I told him I was thrilled. I couldn't be happier for him. I mean, I was very happy that he found something he thought really aligned with his interests, but happier that he was going to be part of the company still, so I would, be able to see him. So I think one key, to deciding whether you want to stay in the profession is to know what's happening in other parts of your organization, to know what other organizations are doing, because there really is so much potential in the space, and you're not limited by geography anymore, with more possibilities for remote work. And if you started in publishing, you might think that's where you need to stay, but there's so many other companies that value the knowledge you have, whether it's a vendor that works with publishers, whether it's a library. One of my friends used to be a licensing manager for Springer, and he went into the consortia space, and now he works for Stanford libraries, managing all of their contracts. So it's very possible, from publishing within scholarly communication to move to different stakeholder segments. So you're probably going to only be rich at heart from scholarly publishing. Like, don't go into it for the money. I would say that, but you will be rewarded through the connections that you make with people. And if you give back your time through volunteering and mentorship, that reward will come back to you tenfold. I guarantee it.
Absolutely, 100%. I fully agree with what you've just said, Heather. Very valuable piece of advice, and I've experienced it myself. Such wonderful friends that I've made in the industry, and always, people have welcomed all of us. There's nothing like a silly question, and you can reach out to anyone, and people manage to give you that time. So, absolutely. As we wrap up today's enlightening conversation with Heather Staines, we would like to thank her for sharing her valuable insights and experiences with us. So, thank you once again, Heather. We really appreciate you giving us this time. And it was fabulous, talking to you.
It's been a pleasure and very informative for me. And if anyone has any follow-on questions for anything that I've mentioned, or just wants to have a chat, they can always reach out.
Thank you, Heather. To our listeners, thank you for joining us on Insights Exchange. Remember, every episode brings us closer to the heart of academic innovation. So stay curious, keep exploring, and join us again as we continue to bring you conversations that are shaping the world of academia. Until next time, keep exchanging insights.